May I stay with you? Human a story in 8 timelines timeline 1 night 1. The question that changed everything. Ethan Vance had been assigned quarters in the Vaelorin Imperial Palace for 22 days. And in that time he had become reasonably certain that unauthorized entry into his room was, for all practical purposes, impossible. The room itself was not particularly grand. Diplomatic functionaries of his rank were not allocated grand, but it had biometric locks calibrated to his specific physiology, 2 layers of guard verification at each corridor junction leading to it, and enough diplomatic immunity documentation wrapped around it that even palace security was technically required to submit a formal request before entering. He had gone over all of this during the initial briefing, partly because it was his job to understand security protocols, and partly because being this far from Earth made him the kind of person who actually read the emergency exit information on long flights. So when his door slid open at 0.43, the sound of it dragged him out of sleep with his hand already reaching for the emergency comm unit. Before his eyes had adjusted to the dark, he stopped. Princess Lyrae was standing in his doorway. Not the version of her he had spent 3 weeks studying from across negotiating tables. Not the one with the elaborate arranged hair and the stacked ceremonial jewelry that encoded her rank at 7 different levels simultaneously. Not the version who moved through diplomatic sessions the way load-bearing walls move through buildings. Deliberate and necessary. This version was wearing something simple and pale that his briefing documents had no category for. Her hair was loose, her ears were bare, and her skin was doing something he had never seen it do. The Vaelorin orientation briefing had spent considerable time explaining the bioluminescent subdermal cells, the way they responded to emotional states, the cultural significance of the color vocabulary, the general understanding that fully suppressing them was both physiologically difficult and considered undignified. In 3 weeks of watching Lyrae across formal tables, Ethan had started to build a rough reading. The controlled diplomatic silver she wore like a uniform in public. The deep blues and purples that sometimes leaked through when a session frustrated her. The brief flash of warm gold that appeared when something genuinely pleased her before she pulled it back under control. Right now her patterns were moving so fast he could not catch individual colors. Blues and purples bleeding into each other, threading through with silver that looked involuntary. Everything cycling in the way the briefing materials had described as the physiological signature of acute emotional overwhelm. She was terrified. Ethan lowered his hand from the comm unit. Every training he had received in 10 years of diplomatic work assembled itself into a clear, unanimous verdict. This was a security anomaly regardless of context. This was politically explosive regardless of intent. This was exactly the sort of situation that Ambassador Reyes described. In the specific exhausted register, she reserved for things that generated paperwork, as a situation requiring immediate documentation and escalation. He looked at Lyrae's face, at the desperate hope threaded through the fear, at the way she was standing precisely at the threshold without stepping in, as though she had already decided she would leave the moment he gave her any reason to. Every calculated response dissolved. May I stay with you tonight? Human. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Nothing like the measured, clear tone she used in the council chamber. Even the phrasing was strange. Human, not his name, not his title. Like she had defaulted to the most neutral possible address because she was not sure she had earned anything more specific. Ethan adjusted the bedside light, dimming it to something that would not feel like interrogation. Your Highness, he said carefully. Are you in danger? Should I contact security? No, please don't. She took one hesitant step into the room. The door slid shut behind her with a quiet, definitive sound. I can't be in my chambers tonight. I can't be surrounded by people who report everything I do back to whoever is most interested in it. And I can't be alone with my thoughts right now. And you are the only person in this entire palace who has no political stake in my future. Ethan processed this. He also registered, about 2 seconds too late, that he was receiving the heir to the Vaelorin Empire in whatever he had worn to sleep. At 0.43, in a situation for which no briefing document had ever prepared him. Please, he said, sit down. He gestured toward the sitting area. 2 chairs and a table he mostly used for reviewing briefing materials at hours he pretended were still reasonable. Lyrae moved to the nearest chair. And even now, even frightened and clearly exhausted and dressed for sleep, the grace was completely automatic. He had watched her maintain perfect composure across 3 weeks of formal sessions, and wondered more than once whether the performance went all the way down. Watching it persist even here made him think differently. He sat in the chair across from her, maintaining a distance that felt respectful rather than cold. "I was going to apologize," she said, and then stopped herself. "No, I came here specifically to stop performing. I should probably not begin again within the first 30 seconds. That seems right." She looked at him directly. Her eyes were wide set, a color that shifted depending on the light in ways the briefing materials had tried and failed to describe. Right now, they were exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Today was difficult," she said. "I witnessed part of it." He chose his words. The council session. Lord Careth and several other nobles spending the better part of 2 hours arguing that the Human Alliance represents a long-term failure of Vaelorin political judgment. That was the public portion, a dry, unhappy quality in her voice. After the diplomatic delegation was dismissed, there were 3 additional hours with my father's inner council detailing, with considerable specificity, the ways in which I am currently failing to meet the requirements of my position. Ethan stayed quiet. "Everything," she continued. Her hands were clasped in her lap with a stillness that looked effortful. "My negotiating instincts. My habit of asking questions rather than issuing directives. My tendency to seek shared ground instead of simply holding the Vaelorin position and waiting for the other side to capitulate. These are all, apparently, symptoms of inexperience at best. And my age, which they frame as inexperience because that is the more diplomatic formulation. They mean the same thing." "Why come here?" Ethan asked. He kept his voice gentle, because the question was not a challenge. He wanted to understand, not questioning your right to be here. "I genuinely want to know why this door, tonight." Her pattern slowed slightly. The blue became more uniform, less frantic. "Lord Carath wants influence over trade policy. My guards want to demonstrate loyalty to advance their household positions. My personal attendants are aligned with different factions, and everything I say in front of them gets filtered through those alignments before it has even left the room." She paused. "You are a mid-level liaison. If I fall apart in front of you, the worst outcome is that you think less of Vaelorin leadership. And you are professional enough not to let that affect your work." It was, Ethan thought, one of the loneliest calculations he had ever heard someone make. "For what it is worth," he said, "from what I have seen in 3 weeks, you are not failing. You are trying to do something genuinely difficult under conditions that would be difficult for most people. That is not the same thing." A brief flicker of gold through the blue. Then the blue came back. "You do not have sufficient understanding of our political structure to evaluate that accurately," she said. "Probably not. But I know enough about people to recognize someone doing their honest best in an impossible situation. That part does not require deep political context." She looked at him for a long moment. "I am scared," she said finally. It came out quieter than everything else she had said, like something she had been carrying at arm's length, and had just decided to set down. "I am scared I am making the wrong decisions, and will not find out until there is nothing left to correct. I am scared the Alliance fails because of something I did or did not do. I am scared that being anything less than perfect for even a single moment is enough to undo everything, and I cannot say that to anyone, because showing fear means showing weakness. And weakness costs authority I have barely managed to build. Except tonight." Ethan said, "Except tonight. To you." She met his eyes. "Are you going to report this conversation?" He sat with the question honestly. His directive was clear. Any unsanctioned private contact with Princess Lyrae was to be documented and escalated. Reyes would expect it. The protocol existed for good reasons. Private, unofficial access to the Imperial heir was exactly the kind of thing that could function as leverage, and both governments had reason to keep that avenue closed. He looked at her face, at the careful, exhausted hope in it. "No," he said, "not unless you want me to. You could use this. Private access to the heir is significant, because using someone's fear for advantage is wrong. Simple as that. And I am here to build something real between our peoples, which does not work if I treat the people as instruments." He paused. "Also, you trusted me enough to come here. I would like to actually be worth that." The gold came back to her patterns then, spreading through the blue and staying. Something in her posture shifted, not relaxing exactly, but settling. The way something that has been held at a costly angle finally finds a neutral position. "I was told," she said, with a note of something that might have been humor working its way through the exhaustion, "that humans are emotionally inconsistent and prone to sentimentality. Some are. The proportion is probably similar across species, honestly. That is either very true or very optimistic. Could be both. Something at the corner of her mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, but close enough that 3 weeks of watching her formal expressions made it remarkable. They talked. Not about politics. Mostly. She told him about growing up as the only heir, about the specific loneliness of having every potential friendship evaluated for political utility before it was permitted to form. She talked about her mother, who had died when Lyrae was 12, in fragments that came out at slightly different angles each time, as though she was still deciding what she remembered and why. She described the experience of being simultaneously compared to an idealized version of someone she had barely known and instructed to forge her own path, as if those were not contradictory instructions issued to the same person. Ethan listened. He asked questions when they felt right, and stayed in the silence when they did not. He offered his own experiences when they seemed genuinely useful. His first posting. The specific mistakes of someone trying to understand a culture through preparation that always missed something essential about what it felt like to actually be there. The friendship he had built during his second posting with a local translator who had permanently changed his understanding of what cross-cultural exchange could actually accomplish. He talked about being wrong about things, specifically, with the kind of detail he had spent years converting into professional lessons and found, in this quiet room, surprisingly easy to just say plainly. At some point, the conversation shifted into something lighter. She had a dry, precise humor that came out sideways, in observations about the absurdity of certain ceremonial protocols, in the wry sidelong quality she applied to things she found frustrating. He told her about a negotiation during his second posting where he had badly misread a cultural convention and accidentally implied his government was offering something it absolutely was not prepared to offer, and the 3 subsequent days of frantic, exhausting correction. She laughed. Not the polished, appropriate version, a real one, surprised out of her, uncontrolled. Her patterns had settled by then into something calm. Soft purples, steady blues, with occasional sweeps of warm gold that came and went as the conversation moved. She was still carrying everything she had arrived with. None of it had gone anywhere, but she looked, Ethan thought, like someone who had been allowed to put a very heavy thing down for a few hours and was beginning to remember what her own body felt like without the weight. When the sky outside began to change, first barely perceptibly, then with more intention, Lyrae stirred. I need to get back before my guards notice the absence and generate an incident. How are you? He asked. She thought about it with the careful seriousness she brought to most things. Better, not fixed, but steadier. She stood, and the grace returned automatically. She moved toward the door. Then she stopped. She had one hand on the door panel, and she turned slightly. And in that motion, her foot caught the edge of the low table in the sitting area, just enough to displace her balance for half a second. She recovered instantly, the way someone with her physical training always would, but in that half second Ethan had already moved, his hand extending out of pure reflex, and they both stopped. His hand was near her arm, not touching, an inch away, maybe less. Her patterns flared, a sudden, involuntary surge of bright gold that spread from her shoulder across her collarbone before she caught it and brought it back under control. It happened in less than 2 seconds. She straightened. He lowered his hand. Neither of them said anything for a moment. I am fine, she said. Her voice was very controlled. I know, he said. His voice was very controlled. She looked at him for one more second. The gold had not entirely left her patterns. It sat in them, quieter now, but present. Thank you, she said finally, for not turning me away, for listening without filing any of it for later use. A pause. Thank you for trusting me enough not to report it. If you need this again, Ethan said, someone outside the political structure who will just listen. I am here. No agenda. That is a risky offer. Her patterns moved through something complicated. I might take you up on it. I hope you do. She studied his face for a moment, seemed to find what she was looking for, nodded once, and was gone. Ethan sat alone in the dim room. His hand was still extended slightly from where he had reached toward her. He put it down. He filed the evening under things the Diplomatic Academy does not prepare you for, and tried to get 2 hours of sleep before the official day began. He did not succeed. Timeline to the morning after. Professional distance. The morning assembly ran with the precision that Ambassador Reyes made look effortless. She reviewed the day's agenda. Morning trade implementation sessions. Afternoon cultural exchange proposals. Formal dinner with selected Vaelorin nobility in the evening. Seating protocol matters to them. Pay attention. All reports due no later than 22:0. Someone had submitted the incorrect form template for the second time. They knew who they were. Ethan took notes. He nodded at appropriate moments. He looked. When required to look at the front of the room. At the front of the room. He did not look at Princess Lyrae when she entered at the scheduled time with her formal retinue. She was in full court presentation, the elaborate hair arrangement, the tiered ceremonial jewelry at her ears, the formal garment whose significance his orientation materials had required 2 full sessions to partially explain. Her bioluminescence was perfectly controlled, diplomatic silver with measured pulses of color, indicating appropriate attentiveness. When her gaze moved across the assembled diplomatic delegation during the opening remarks, it passed over Ethan's position with the same measured professional courtesy it extended to everyone else in the room. No signal. No acknowledgement. Nothing that would suggest she knew his name in any context other than the official records. He told himself this was exactly right. This was the correct outcome. She had needed somewhere safe to be for a few hours. He had provided it. They had returned to professional distance. This was what should happen. He almost believed it through the entirety of the morning trade session. He also noticed, because it was impossible not to notice once you were paying the right kind of attention, that Lyrae was sharper than she had been at any session in 3 weeks. Not dramatically. Most people in the room probably read it as competent engagement, but he had been watching her specifically for 22 days, and the difference was visible. Her questions were more direct. The gaps she identified in proposed frameworks were caught faster. When one of the senior Kelvari trade officials spent 23 minutes talking around a problem without naming it, Lyrae named it in a single sentence and proposed a resolution that the room spent the following 40 minutes working toward. Brilliant. Not just trained or technically capable. Genuinely, functionally brilliant. In the specific way that made visible the things other people were looking directly at and not seeing. And the room was receiving her contributions with the polite attention they would offer a capable junior participant. Not with the recognition that she was frequently the sharpest analyst at the table. Ethan found this irritating in a way that was entirely new. He found himself watching her during the afternoon session as well, tracking the small, precise ways her mind moved through a problem, the questions that reframed instead of just responded. At one point, their eyes met briefly across the table when she identified the same flaw in a proposed implementation framework, half a second before he was going to raise it himself. The eye contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds. She looked away first. He made his notes. At the afternoon break, Ambassador Reyes appeared at his elbow. "Walk with me," she said. Not a question. They found a secure consultation room. Reyes waited for the door to seal before speaking. "Something happened last night." Ethan kept his expression neutral. "Ambassador, don't manage me. I have been doing this for 28 years. Her voice was not unkind. "The princess's behavior today is different. More centered. More effective. You have the particular look of someone who spent half the night sitting with something they cannot put in a report. Is there anything I need to know?" He found the narrow path. "Nothing occurred that poses a risk to the mission or requires immediate action," he said. "If that changes, you will be the first person I tell." Race studied him with the focused attention of someone who had extracted accurate information from diplomatic professionals under considerably more pressure than this. "You are protecting someone," she said finally. "I am going to trust you to know the difference between a confidence worth keeping and a political disaster in development. Do not make me wrong about that. I won't. Ambassador, for what it is worth, whatever you did or did not do last night, the princess has been more effective today than at any point since we arrived. That is good for everyone. Keep it good for everyone." Ethan went back to his notes. He thought about Lyrae naming a problem in one sentence that others had spent 20 minutes obscuring. He thought about her telling him that her father's advisors had spent 3 hours that evening explaining her failures. He went back to his notes. Timeline 3-2 weeks. The shape of a pattern. The arrangement formed itself across the following 2 weeks, without either of them formally proposing it. Every 2 or 3 evenings, Princess Lyrae submitted a proper official request for cultural consultation with Liaison Vance regarding human diplomatic frameworks and negotiation contexts. Logged. Approved. Documented. Her guards escorted her to his quarters, confirmed the session for the record, and maintained corridor positions for the duration. Sessions lasted 30 to 45 minutes. The official reports Ethan filed afterward covered real material, because real material was always discussed. Human institutional psychology, cultural context behind specific negotiating positions. The way human consensus building worked in contrast to Vaelorin directive structures. Ambassador Reyes reviewed these reports periodically. She asked no more direct questions. What the reports did not cover were the conversations that occupied the middle of each meeting, in the space between the formal opening and the formal close. He was learning who Lyrae was, not just her patterns, though those became more legible with each meeting. A vocabulary built in small increments that he had not expected to develop. He was learning the person underneath the role, the way you learned anyone, through what they returned to, what they avoided, where the phrasing went careful and where it went unguarded. She was funny, in a way that kept surprising him. The humor was dry and came in at oblique angles, and it appeared more consistently than he had initially realized. An observation about the structural absurdity of certain ceremonial protocols. A wry sidelong quality she applied to things that frustrated her. The occasional small absurdism that appeared right in the middle of serious discussions and then vanished again. He started looking for it after the third meeting. He found it reliably. She was more empathetic than her training had managed to redirect. The Vaelorin political education clearly tried to instill a transactional framework. People as positions. Relationships as utilities. She could operate within that framework when she needed to, and was competent at it. But underneath it was a persistent, apparently ineradicable tendency to care about the actual people on the other side of every decision. To think about the specific individuals affected rather than the abstract population. This tendency operated regardless of whether it was politically convenient. Apparently, it frequently was not. She was uncertain about things she had been trained to project confidence about, and certain about things she had been trained to treat as adjustable. And watching her navigate the space between those two conditions was quietly remarkable. The fourth session ran long. They had been discussing the way human diplomatic teams built internal positions, how consensus formed before anything was presented externally. The specific function of the lead negotiator as translator between institutional constraints and individual judgment. Lyrae was asking precise questions. The work was genuine. Then the official portion ended, and the silence that followed was the kind that had started to feel comfortable, rather than awkward. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said. "You generally do, in sessions, when you spot a flaw in someone's reasoning, which you do reliably. You always frame it as a question rather than a correction. You set it up so the person being corrected can accept it without looking like they have been corrected in front of their peers." She tilted her head slightly. "Yes, why? Direct identification would be faster. It would also end the working relationship," she said. "Correct someone directly and you win that moment and lose every subsequent exchange with them, because they spend the rest of your time together, trying to recover the standing they lost publicly. The question framing accomplishes the same correction without that residue. A pause. Some of it is genuine belief, and some of it is training. I was shown a detailed historical account of a predecessor who operated differently, and the consequences. So it is a mixture. Which part is actually yours?" She thought about it. "I believe the underlying principle. I would have arrived at some version of it independently. Not necessarily this exact version. The specific framing was trained into me, and I can feel that when I am doing it. The way you can feel when you are reaching for something someone else constructed, rather than something you worked out yourself. Can I tell you what I observe when you do it? I imagine you are going to. Someone who has been so thoroughly educated in the political implications of everything she does, that she cannot always tell which responses are actually hers, and which are just the installed default." He said it without judgment. "That is not a criticism. I just notice it. I was wondering if you notice it too." Her patterns moved through something complicated. "I notice it," she said quietly. "I do not always know what to do with the noticing. You do not have to do anything with it right now. You can just say it." And she did. That session ran considerably longer than the official 30 minutes, and the report Ethan filed afterward covered a fraction of what was actually discussed. They talked about the specific texture of being educated toward a role from childhood, the way certain reflexes became indistinguishable from instincts until you found yourself in a context where the reflexes were not operative, and they persisted anyway. And you had to consciously determine what was actually yours versus what had been installed. Ethan found himself saying things he had not planned to say about his own formation, the accumulated effect of 10 years of training in how to read rooms, manage impressions, translate intention across cultural gaps. About the moment during a difficult negotiation several years ago when he had noticed, with unusual clarity, that he was performing diplomatic composure rather than experiencing it, and the strange vertiginous quality of recognizing that from inside it. "What did you do?" she asked. "Kept performing it. The situation required it. But I started paying attention to the difference afterward, between when I was genuinely settled and when I was doing a convincing enough impression of settled. And now I am usually somewhere between the two, which might just be what professional equanimity actually is. Not the absence of the performance, but to the point where performance and reality start to overlap enough that the distinction stops mattering." She looked at him with the quality of attention he had come to recognize as what it looked like when something had genuinely landed for her. "You are not what I expected from a foreign diplomatic functionary," she said. "What did you expect? Someone more interested in appearing useful than being useful." A pause. Someone who would have reported that first night. Appearing appropriately transparent seemed less important than actually being worth trusting. The gold in her patterns shifted to something steadier, warmer. "That is going to be a recurring problem for you in this profession, I suspect. It already has been." Something in her expression shifted, and then the dry humor appeared. The version she reserved for things that were both frustrating and somehow clarifying. "I find it simultaneously irritating and reassuring. I will take it." The sessions continued, 2 or 3 evenings a week, always official in framing, always genuine in substance. He was learning the patterns the way you learned a language, not by studying the rules but by immersing in the thing itself. Warm gold for happiness or gratitude, sometimes as a mixture he could not fully separate. Deep blue for worry, a concentrated darker version for specific concerns, a more diffuse blue-purple for the general weight of the position. The rapid cycling that appeared when too many things pressed at once. The formal silvers she wore in public sessions, and the thing he had stopped being able to explain away. A soft pink-gold combination that appeared when the conversation went somewhere genuine, something that corresponded, when he allowed himself to sit with what it felt like to observe it. To affection, he was developing a problem. He was fully aware of it. He chose, for the moment, to keep that awareness at a slight distance and focus on what was in front of him. Toward the end of the second week, Lyrae arrived for a documented session with a quality of restraint that was different from her usual controlled composure. Something was being contained more carefully than usual. The official portion ran first, 25 minutes of genuine, accurate work that would file correctly. Then the official portion ended, and the contained thing came forward. "Lord Careth met privately with my father today," she said. Her patterns were deep blue. 2 hours. I do not know the specific content. What I know is that immediately afterward, 2 advisors who had been reliably neutral started raising procedural concerns about the Alliance implementation timeline. Pause. Careth does not attack directly. He repositions the people around his target until the target is isolated. He is moving against the Alliance through your father's counsel. He has been moving since before you arrived. This is a new angle. She was quiet for a moment. "I know I am not supposed to tell you this. You are technically on the other side of the negotiating table, and this is politically sensitive information. I know. But if his repositioning works, the implementation discussions next week will be harder than they should be, and you should go in prepared rather than surprised." She met his eyes. "I am trusting you with that." Ethan sat with the weight of it. She had given him something his superiors would consider valuable intelligence, and she had done it not as a tactical move but as an act of trust. And those were very different things, even when they looked similar from the outside. "I will use it to be better prepared," he said. "Not to position." "I know," she said. "That is why I told you." Her patterns were warm gold for the rest of the session, what the reports did not cover. The third session ran differently than the first 2. The first 2 had a careful quality, both of them feeling the edges of what they were creating. The official portion running properly and the space in the middle being handled with a kind of mutual uncertainty about how far it extended. By the third session, something had shifted, not dramatically. Just the difference between 2 people in a hallway who are not sure they know each other, and 2 people who have already established, without saying so, that they do. She told him about the garden. It came out sideways, in the middle of something else. The way things came out when you were talking to someone who was actually listening. There was a garden in the eastern wing of the palace that she had been permitted to visit twice in her entire life. Once at age 7, when she had gotten lost during an official event, and a guard had found her there. and once at 15 when she had asked specifically, and the request had been considered and cautiously approved. Both times she had spent the entire visit memorizing it, she said, because she knew the access was unlikely to be repeated. The specific way the light moved through the upper canopy, the sound it made, the smell of it. She could describe both visits in detail and had thought about them frequently since. How frequently? Ethan asked. She looked at him. More frequently than is probably reasonable. Have you asked about access again? Several times. It is not considered a relevant use of my time. What is considered a relevant use of your time? She recited the list. It was long and specific and contained nothing that resembled a garden. Ethan thought about this for a moment. What would happen if you went? I would need to arrange guard positioning, submit a request through the appropriate channels, receive approval from my father's household administrative office, and schedule it during a time that did not conflict with any diplomatic or council obligations. A pause, which would be approximately never. Or, Ethan said, you could just go. She looked at him with an expression that was hard to interpret at first, until he realized it was the expression of someone who had not seriously considered that as a possibility in a very long time. I could not just go, she said. I know, he said. But it is interesting that the first response was not you could not. It was the list of required steps. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with a specific dry quality that meant she found something both frustrating and correct. You are annoyingly good at that. At what? Identifying the thing I do not want to look at directly. I have had some practice. Different context. Same skill. What is the context? He told her about his second posting, the translator he had worked with. A man named Ito, who had spent the first 3 weeks asking Ethan questions he kept deflecting and then pointing out, very gently and very precisely, that he was deflecting. It had been, at the time, irritating. It had also, in retrospect, been the most useful professional relationship of his career. What did he point at? Lyrae asked. The assumption that understanding a culture was something you could accomplish through study, rather than through genuine relationship. I had very thorough preparation, very organized notes, very carefully developed frameworks. None of it was wrong, but I was using all of it to maintain a professional distance that I had convinced myself was respect, but was actually fear. Fear of what? Of being genuinely in it, he said. Of caring about the outcome in a way that was not just professional. Of things mattering. She was quiet for a long time after that. I think, she said finally, that I have spent most of my life doing something similar. Except I convinced myself it was necessary rather than fear. That the distance was required by the position. Maybe it was, Ethan said. Somewhat. But maybe the required amount and the actual amount diverged at some point without you noticing. Another long quiet. Yes, she said. I think that is probably accurate. The gold in her patterns was steady and warm for the rest of the session. He also spent a considerable portion of the following 3 days thinking about Ito, and about the specific moment during that second posting when he had realized that the distance he had been maintaining was costing more than it was protecting. That had been a professional realization, at the time. A recalibration of his approach to cross-cultural work. This felt like something with a different shape. The anonymous message arrived, and he sat with it seriously, and concluded what he concluded. And then he went back to his notes, and his reports, and his documented consultation sessions, and his careful positioning in the official record. And continued, because the alternative was not something he was willing to choose. What the patterns started to mean by the 5th week of documented sessions, he had a vocabulary of approximately 40 distinct states. Not all of them had words in either language he spoke. The briefing materials had given him the basic framework, but the granularity he was developing was specific to Lyrae, the particular expressions of her specific emotional landscape, the way her patterns moved when she was thinking, versus when she was feeling something she was not yet sure she wanted to feel. There was one he had started calling the contemplation gold, for lack of a better term. Not the bright involuntary flare that happened when something surprised her. Not the steady warm version that appeared when a conversation had gone somewhere genuine. A different quality, cooler and more deliberate, that appeared when she was sitting with something and had not yet decided what to do with it. He had first noticed it in the 4th session when he had asked her which part of the correction as question approach was actually hers. It had appeared again in the 7th session when he had told her about Ito, and again in the 9th. When the conversation had reached a particular stillness neither of them had planned. He had a theory about what it meant. He was keeping the theory at a slight distance for the moment. He was also, separately, aware of the specific weight of her attention when it was fully on him, not the professionally engaged attention she brought to sessions. The other kind. The version that appeared when she had stopped performing anything and was just present, looking at him with the focused quality of someone deciding what they were actually seeing. He had become aware of it the way you became aware of weather. Not something you watched arriving, but something you found yourself already in. He was keeping that awareness at a slight distance as well. Some things were better understood slowly. Timeline 4: The Shadow Game. Kareth moves. Lord Kareth cornered Ethan on the 4th day of the 3rd week, extracting him from a session break with the ease of someone for whom such maneuvers were entirely reflexive. A moment of your time. Liaison Vance. They found an alcove off the main negotiating chamber. Ethan noted exits, assessed sightlines, maintained a professionally neutral expression. I find myself curious, Kareth began, without ceremony, about the nature of your relationship with Princess Lyrae. My relationship with Princess Lyrae is limited to standard diplomatic consultation protocols. My lord. Interesting. Kareth's patterns were controlled and deliberate, calculated, with something beneath that the briefing materials had labeled as contempt held in formal reserve. She has been noticeably different these past days, more composed, more effective. One might observe that she appears to have found some source of support that was not previously available to her. Princess Lyrae is recognized throughout the diplomatic community for her analytical capabilities. Perhaps adequate rest has allowed her to operate at full capacity. Perhaps. A slight inclination of his head. I should mention that palace security maintains thorough movement logs, corridor records, biometric signatures, guard positioning documentation, entirely routine, reviewed infrequently under normal circumstances. However, when concerns about unauthorized contact arise, these logs receive closer attention. Patterns emerge. Ethan held his expression exactly where it was. I am not certain I follow the implication, my lord. I am implying nothing at all, Kareth said pleasantly. I am simply observing that Princess Lyrae's support for the human alliance is, among a significant portion of the noble council, already a matter of concern. Any suggestion of inappropriate personal involvement with a human diplomat would be significant. For her, for you, for everything both governments have built. I understand that completely. My lord. Excellent. Then we have no concerns between us. A precise smile. I look forward to our continued cooperation. Kareth left. Ethan stood in the alcove and worked through the actual structure of what had just happened. What Kareth had said was not "stop this or I will expose it." It was considerably more precise than that. It was "I already have enough to damage you both whenever I choose to use it. So now you understand exactly what continuing costs." The distinction mattered. Deterrence, not action. At least for now. The anonymous message arrived 8 days later. It came through an internal palace channel with no registered sender. 3 lines. She is playing you. Heirs do not seek unofficial cultural consultation with mid-level foreign liaisons. They seek access and leverage. You are providing both. Stop being naive. Ethan read it twice, filed it without responding, and then spent the better part of 3 days sitting with it in a way he had not expected to need. The rational approach was clear. Take the possibility seriously. Evaluate the evidence against it. Arrive at a conclusion. The problem was that the rational approach kept running up against specific, documented observations. Her patterns on the first night, the physiological cycling under acute stress, which the briefing materials noted was difficult to consciously control. The fragments about her mother that came out inconsistently across different conversations, with the slight variations of genuinely remembered things rather than the careful consistency of constructed narratives. The garden she had mentioned once that she had visited twice in her life, and thought about with apparently unreasonable frequency. Specific and non-strategic. Useful to no one. The intelligence about Kareth's meeting with her father. Information she had no tactical reason to share if she were building leverage rather than trust. He worked through every angle. He could not make the manipulation reading fit the evidence. When Lyrae arrived for her next documented session, he mentioned the message directly, after the official portion, because not mentioning it felt like its own kind of calculation. She was quiet for a moment. Could it be true? She asked. Direct, without defensiveness. I sat with it seriously for 3 days. Ethan said. I went back through everything, and I cannot make it fit. The fear on the first night was physiological. not performed. The details you share are too specific and too inconsistently remembered to be constructed. The information about Karath. There was no strategic reason to give me that if you were building leverage rather than trust. You could still be wrong about me. I could. I do not think I am. I am not using you. She met his eyes steadily. I want that stated clearly, even though you already believe it, because it is true, and I want it said rather than assumed. What is happening here? These conversations. This space. It is the only honest thing in my life right now. And I understand that sounds like what someone constructing a manipulation would also say. And I cannot resolve that paradox for you. You do not have to. Ethan said. I resolved it already. Her patterns were warm gold for the rest of the meeting. And that, he found, was that. Timeline 5, the Unity Ceremony. 3 hours of perfect. The Unity Ceremony was what 6 months of work had been building toward. A formal, treaty-level recognition of the human Vaelorin alliance. Not the provisional working arrangement that had been operating while details were settled, but the permanent commitment that changed the political landscape for both peoples. The ceremony itself drew from Vaelorin traditions predating spaceflight, required a sequence of symbolic exchanges with historical significance, and involved protocols that Ethan had spent 2 weeks studying in preparation for being an observer in the diplomatic section. His role was to watch, take notes, be available for cultural context if needed. Standard. He had done this kind of thing before. What he had not done before was watch someone he knew, genuinely knew, in the specific way that came from weeks of late-night conversation, rather than formal professional exposure. Carry the full ceremonial weight of a civilizational milestone, while he was close enough to see where the performance was starting to cost her. Lyrae was flawless. The formal address was precisely calibrated, eloquent without being hollow, warm without sacrificing the occasion's gravity. Honoring Vaelorin tradition while making clear that this was a forward-looking moment rather than a ceremonial obligation. Her bioluminescent patterns were deliberate and controlled. Ceremonial silvers and blues, with the occasional pulse of imperial gold that arrived at the formally significant moments with exact timing. Every motion, every pause, every modulation of tone was exactly right. Ethan watched her patterns cycle for precisely half a second before she began speaking. Fast, the way they did when too many things were pressing at once. Then they steadied. Nobody else would have seen what preceded the steadying. He noticed the particular quality of her stillness. Not ease, but sustained act of will. The tension in her shoulders that was 1 degree higher than the formal occasion required. The precision of her movements, which spoke of calculation rather than natural confidence. The specific mechanics of someone holding themselves together through intention across 3 consecutive hours that required them to appear, as if holding together required no effort at all. The ceremony ran its full duration. Then, the reception. Ethan circulated, made conversation, provided context when asked, and tracked Lyrae's position across the room with the awareness that had become automatic. She was extraordinary at the sustained performance. 4 hours of reception after 3 hours of ceremony, and she maintained everything without visible seam. Every political conversation navigated. Every approach from the opposition faction handled correctly. Every noble who approached with a comment containing multiple implied levels received exactly the right response. He saw her pattern cycle twice, briefly, before she caught them. He saw Kareth watching her with the evaluative attention of someone recording evidence. And then, in the final hour of the reception, something happened. The crowd shifted as a group of senior officials moved through together, the way crowds shifted at formal events. And for a moment, the flow of bodies brought Lyrae suddenly into the space directly beside Ethan. Not planned. A movement of perhaps 12 people that briefly closed the distance between them to less than a foot. She felt it before she saw him. He saw her turn, saw the recognition in her face in the same moment he registered her proximity. And for approximately 4 seconds, neither of them moved. Her patterns flared, a sudden, involuntary surge of warm gold, broader and brighter than anything he had seen in a formal setting, spreading from her collarbone upward before she caught it and drew it back under control. The crowd shifted again and carried several people between them, and the 4 seconds ended. She did not look back at him. He did not look at her, but his heart was beating faster than the occasion required, and he was fairly certain he was not the only one. When the reception finally ended and he returned to his quarters, tired in the specific way of prolonged professional performance, he found a message on his personal communicator from an unregistered sender. Please, tonight. I really need this. Careful phrasing. No names. Nothing that constituted evidence of anything. Read in isolation. He sat with it for a long moment. Tonight was objectively the wrong night. Heightened attention after a significant public event. Kareth's watchfulness at elevated intensity. Increased likelihood of anything irregular being noticed. He thought about her patterns flaring gold in the crowd. Involuntary. Wide. Before she pulled them back. He thought about 4 seconds of proximity neither of them had chosen and neither of them had moved away from. He sent back. Yes, timeline 6 the night after, what cannot be performed. 17 minutes later, she was at his door. Moving quickly, in a way that was a departure from her habitual precise grace. The moment the door closed behind her, the composure that had held for 7 consecutive hours came apart. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have been visible from a distance. But in the very specific way of something maintained past its structural limit finally releasing. She sat in the chair. Her patterns cycled rapidly. I cannot do that indefinitely, she said. Her voice had lost all formal cadence. I know the position requires it. I know there is no alternative. But I performed for 7 hours today. I performed correctly. Every gesture, every response, every pattern on my skin timed for what the occasion required. And now I am supposed to go back to my chambers where the attendants are all reporting to someone, and I just... She stopped. You are here, Ethan said. My father. For the ceremony. He found me in the preparation room. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. I kept thinking he was going to say something. Anything. That we had worked hard for this. That tonight mattered. What he said was, do not embarrass us. Everything depends on your performance. That was the entirety of the exchange. Ethan did not say anything. There was nothing that would help. Kareth found me during the first reception hour, told me the address had been adequate, said I should exercise appropriate caution regarding personal connections that might appear unsuitable to outside observers. Her patterns darkened. He knows there is something. He does not have proof yet, but he is close. He made the same implication to me, weeks ago, and since. If he finds evidence, it becomes a weapon. I know. Ethan met her eyes. But, Lyrae, you coming here tonight, are you telling me you want to stop? She was quiet for a long moment. I tried not to come, she said. The entire walk back from the reception, I was telling myself it was too dangerous, that I had to manage without this, that I was being reckless. Her patterns shifted, and then I got to my chambers and there was an attendant who reports to my father's inner circle, and another who is definitely Kareth's placement. And the silence after the door closed was the same silence I have been living in for weeks, except tonight it was heavier, because the ceremony was supposed to be significant and there was no one in that room I could tell it to. What it actually felt like. Not one person. You can tell me, Ethan said. She looked at him. Something moved through her patterns. Not the rapid cycling of overwhelm, but something slower. More considered. Terrifying, she said. From the moment I walked into that hall. Not terrified of failing publicly. I knew I was not going to fail publicly. I am too well formed to fail publicly. Terrified of what comes after. Whether the commitment holds. Whether the people who signed this actually believe in it or just need it to be true for now. Whether in 10 years someone looks back at tonight and decides it was the moment things went wrong. Or the moment things started to go right. She exhaled slowly. And I could not say any of that to anyone. Because showing uncertainty about the treaty is showing weakness about the treaty. So I stood up there and said what needed to be said. And performed the patterns that needed to be performed. And shook the hands that needed to be shaken. And answered every question exactly correctly. She met his eyes. And then I came here. I am glad you did. I am glad you said yes. A pause that had a different quality than her usual pauses. Marcus. She stopped. Ethan. She corrected herself immediately. Ethan, I want to say something and I am not entirely sure I should. He waited. What is happening between us? It stopped being straightforward at some point. I am not certain when, and I am not asking for anything to be different. I am not suggesting we do anything differently. I am only... She looked at her hands for a moment, then back up at him. I am only saying that I am aware of it, because not saying it, to you of all people, in this space of all spaces, feels like exactly the kind of dishonesty I come here to escape. The room was very quiet. I know, Ethan said. He said it simply, without managing it. I have been aware of it too. That makes everything considerably more complicated. Yes, and you are still here. I am not going anywhere. She looked at him for a long moment. Her patterns were very still. The way they went still when she had made a decision rather than when she was suppressing something. I told myself when I walked in tonight, she said, that I was not going to say that. That some things were better understood than said. That acknowledging it out loud would make it harder to manage. Pause. I think I was wrong about that. I think you were too. The gold in her pattern spread slowly. A different quality of gold than the involuntary flare in the reception crowd. This one was deliberate. She knew it was there, and she was letting it be there. They talked until the second dawn. Not about politics. About what Lyrae would want if the role did not define the entire frame of her life. She said she thought she would want to learn things that had no application to anything. Music theory, maybe. Kelvar had a formal compositional tradition she had heard in fragments passing through rooms and had never been allowed to study. She would want to be bad at something without anyone caring about it. What would you want? She asked him. More of this. Honestly, he said. More conversations that go somewhere real. More of knowing who someone actually is rather than who they are professionally required to be. That is what you want in general, she said. What would you want for yourself specifically? Things you set aside. He sat with it honestly. I had a mentor during my first posting who told me the work would cost me relationships. That the posting cycles and the geographical distance, and the particular kind of presence the job required, would make it difficult to build anything lasting. He was right. I knew he was right when he said it. He paused. I think I told myself it was a trade-off I could make, because I had not yet encountered something I did not want to trade away. She did not say anything for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. And now I think about it differently, he said. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. Toward dawn, she shifted in her chair, and the movement brought her leaning forward slightly. And in that forward lean, her hand came to rest on the arm of the chair nearest his side of the small table. Not reaching, just resting. 6 inches from where his own hand rested on the table surface. Neither of them moved. They stayed like that for a long time, both of them looking at some middle distance. Neither speaking. Her hand on the chair arm and his hand on the table. 6 inches of uncrossed space between them that neither of them crossed and neither of them moved away from. When she finally stood to leave, she straightened slowly. And the motion brought her to standing directly in front of him, and he stood as well. And for a moment they were close. Not as close as the accidental 4 seconds at the reception. Closer. He did not move. She did not move. Thank you, she said. Her voice was low. For seeing me. For letting me see you. That is not a small thing. No, he said. It is not. One more moment. Then she stepped back, and the moment ended, and she moved to the door. She stopped at the threshold, the same way she always did. Same time tomorrow, she said. It came out differently than usual. Less careful, more direct. Ethan looked at her. The gold in her patterns was steady and warm and entirely present. Yes, he said. After she was gone. He sat in the chair she had occupied and looked at the small table between where they had been. The 6 inches of space that had not been crossed. He sat there for a long time. Timeline 7 evidence on the table. The crisis 3 days after the Unity ceremony. Ambassador Reyes was at Ethan's door at 8. 9. With the expression she used when something had gone wrong in a way that required significant management. Conference room, she said. Now. The secure suite held 4 people when Ethan arrived. Reyes, Lord Kareth, and a Vaelorin security official named Tovar, whom Ethan had seen at formal events but never engaged with directly. Tovar had the bearing of someone who dealt with palace politics regularly enough to have developed a comprehensive personal policy of exhaustion toward it. Liaison Vance. Reyes's voice was formal in the register she used when the record needed to be clear. Allegations have been raised concerning conduct outside approved diplomatic parameters. Lord Kareth has compiled evidence suggesting repeated, unauthorized private contact with Princess Lyrae beyond sanctioned channels. Kareth activated a display. The security logs were thorough. Not just the documented consultation sessions, which were all properly filed, but a pattern of secondary data. Corridor records. Biometric traces. Guard positioning data that stopped just short of direct proof but constituted. In aggregate. What Karath described as a systematic pattern across 5 instances over 14 days. One anomalous access record is a sensor calibration issue. Karath said, 5 correlated anomalies across 2 weeks constitute intentional circumvention of oversight protocols. He looked at Ethan. I will ask you directly. What was the nature and extent of your private contact with Princess Lyrae? Every professional instinct Ethan had spent a decade developing was in agreement. Contest the evidence. Establish alternative explanations. Use the circumstantial nature of what was displayed. The evidence was circumstantial. A capable rebuttal could keep it there. He looked at Reyes's expression. Underneath the control was something that looked like, please do not make this worse. He thought about sitting across from Lyrae and saying, I am not going anywhere. He chose the narrow path. Princess Lyrae visited my quarters on several occasions beyond the documented consultation sessions, he said. Our conversations addressed the pressures of her position, the specific isolation of being unable to speak openly with anyone embedded in the political hierarchy around her, the difficulty of maintaining effective leadership under conditions that do not allow genuine expression of uncertainty. Nothing in those conversations falls outside acceptable parameters under either human or Vaelorin standards. We talked. She needed someone outside the political structure to listen without agenda. Provided that. Tovar leaned forward. You provided unsanctioned private access to the Imperial heir without oversight. That is a protocol violation regardless of content. She asked me not to report the visits. I honored that request. Liaison. Reyes said his name with the weight of trust being placed under pressure. You understand why you should have reported this to me immediately, regardless of her request. I understand the protocol completely. I made a deliberate choice to prioritize her well-being over it. I am not asking that choice to resolve the violation. Do you regret it? Kareth asked. The question was smooth, probing for something specific. Ethan sat with it honestly. No. Kareth's expression shifted fractionally. Then you are acknowledging that your personal judgment superseded your diplomatic mandate, which is itself evidence of compromised objectivity. I am acknowledging that I chose to help someone who needed help. You can describe that as compromised objectivity. I would describe it as basic human responsibility that happened to apply in a non-human context. This is not a human context, Tovar said, not unkindly. Our standards for contact with the Imperial heir exist for reasons that apply regardless of your cultural baseline. I understand that. I understood it at the time. The meeting moved through its procedural stages. Ethan suspended from active duties pending investigation, confined to quarters except for scheduled interview sessions. All contact with Princess Lyrae formally prohibited. Karath wore the satisfaction of someone who had achieved what he came to achieve. Tovar looked tired. Reyes looked like she was already 3 steps into managing the implications. Ethan walked back to his quarters and sat down and looked at the ceiling. He thought about whether any of it changed the choices he had made. It did not. He was drafting mental notes about how to explain this to institutional superiors when his door chimed with official credentials. Reyes, alone. She sat without waiting to be asked. Everything, she said, not the managed version. All of it. From the beginning. So he told her. The door opening at 0.43. Lyrae in the doorway, with her patterns cycling through fear. The choice not to reach for the comm unit. What she had asked and what he had said and why. The conversations that followed. The official cover created not to hide something inappropriate, but to protect something genuine from a political context that would use it against them both. What he had learned about who Lyrae was underneath the role, and what it cost her every day to maintain the role without anywhere to set it down. He told Reyes that he cared about Lyrae. He said it directly. Reyes was quiet for some time. You fell for her, she said. I care about her. That is what I said. She looked at him with an expression that held several things at once. The anti-alliance faction is going to argue that her support for the treaty reflects emotional compromise rather than political analysis. That she was influenced through an unauthorized personal relationship. That is not what happened. I know that. You know that. Karath does not care what actually happened. He needs what it can be made to look like. And you gave him material. She exhaled. What I need you to understand is that he will use it without hesitation. Before he could respond, his communicator showed an emergency designation for all personnel. Reyes checked hers simultaneously. Get ready, she said. Something has changed. Timeline 8 the assembly, and what comes after. Everything in the open. The Grand Diplomatic Hall was full in the way that indicated something significant had happened quickly. The entire human delegation was present. Senior Vaelorin officials occupied one side of the space. Junior staff lined the back. In the center stood Princess Lyrae in full formal attire, her bioluminescence controlled to perfect ceremonial stillness. Beside her stood the Emperor. Ethan's escort brought him to a position near the delegation section. He was aware of the attention in the room with the uncomfortable, specific clarity of being the subject of it. The Emperor spoke first. It has come before us that Princess Lyrae has engaged in unauthorized private contact with a member of the human diplomatic delegation. This constitutes a departure from established protocol and raises questions regarding the appropriate conduct of diplomatic personnel in relation to the imperial house. Ethan stood still. Lyrae spoke. Father, members of this council, representatives of the human delegation. Her voice was different. Not the carefully managed tone of formal addresses. Something more direct. Less processed. Like she had decided this specific occasion required something other than management. I visited Liaison Vance on several occasions outside sanctioned channels. I did this because I was struggling under pressure I could not address with anyone in my immediate political environment. Because everyone in that environment has a stake in how I respond to pressure, and that stake distorts every interaction I have with them. I needed someone outside that structure. He was the only person in this palace who qualified. Kareth stepped forward. Your Highness, with respect, the concern here is precisely the appearance. I know exactly what your concern is, Lord Kareth. Her patterns flickered once. Something sharp and controlled. You have spent the entirety of this alliance's development looking for evidence that it represents a failure of Vaelorin political judgment. You have been waiting for an opportunity of exactly this kind, and you have found something that looks, in the right framing, like what you have been waiting for. She did not look away from him. I would like this council to consider the other framing. The hall was very quiet. If a human diplomat and a Vaelorin heir can develop genuine trust across every boundary we have constructed between our peoples, political, cultural, hierarchical, biological, then that is not evidence that the alliance is compromised. It is evidence that the alliance can accomplish exactly what it claims to. She let it rest for a moment. The connection between us is real. I am not denying it. I am disputing what it demonstrates. Kareth's voice was controlled but compressed. Your Highness, the appearance of impropriety is a weapon, is how you intend to use it. She addressed the full assembly. I was struggling. I found one person in this palace willing to listen to that without leveraging it for advantage. I protected that because it was the only honest relationship in my life at the time. Judge that as you need to, but understand that the need it addressed was genuine, and the judgment that found him trustworthy was sound judgment. The silence that followed had the particular quality of silence after something has shifted the weight of a room. The Emperor smiled, not the occasion-appropriate expression, a genuine one, warm in a way his public face rarely allowed, and it changed the shape of his face considerably. An audible reaction moved through the assembled crowd. Lord Kareth, the Emperor said, and there was something dry in his tone that was apparently hereditary. You came before this council with the intent of undermining an alliance by exposing what you characterized as inappropriate contact between my daughter and a human diplomat. You have instead provided the most compelling demonstration of this alliance's potential I have yet witnessed in 6 months of negotiations. He turned to Ethan. Liaison Vance. Did you manipulate my daughter for diplomatic advantage? The room was very quiet. Ethan had a moment to decide who he was going to be in front of everyone in this hall. He decided to be the same person he had been at 0.43 in the dark. No, Your Majesty. I befriended her. I listened to her. I cared about her well-being because she is brilliant and kind, and was carrying something alone that would be a great deal for most people to carry. And I could not watch that happen from close range and do nothing. He paused. If the question is fully on the table, I care about her beyond any diplomatic consideration. Not because of what it means for the alliance, because she deserves to have someone in her corner who is there for no other reason. Kareth made a sound of precise contempt. This is emotional manipulation framed as enough. The Emperor's voice had an edge that required no volume. I am watching my daughter speak with more clarity and force than I have seen from her in any session I have attended. I am watching her defend this human with conviction that is not performance. And I am noting that she has been more effective as a political leader in the period since these unauthorized meetings began than in the entire preceding quarter. He looked at Kareth steadily. Those are not the behaviors of someone being manipulated. Those are the behaviors of someone who found genuine support. He addressed the assembly formally, what the oversight looked like from inside it. The first 3 weeks of the supervised arrangement were, in practical terms, the most difficult, not because of what was between them, which had not changed and was not going to change, based on the presence of additional documentation personnel, but because the form in which they had been building the thing had been specific to its conditions. And those conditions were now entirely different. and neither of them had any experience navigating this particular transition. The oversight personnel rotated on a weekly schedule. The Vaelorin appointee in the first rotation was clearly Kareth's placement, which both of them had known the moment she entered the room for the first session. She documented with an adversarial thoroughness that was essentially its own form of message. Ethan and Lyrae both treated her with meticulous professional courtesy and adjusted their sessions accordingly. The human appointee in that same week was a mid-level diplomatic official named Perez, who had apparently been fully briefed on the history and decided that his personal policy was principled non-intrusiveness. He was physically present for every documentation interval and appeared, in every other respect, to be operating in a different room entirely. Ethan was more grateful for this than he would have been able to express professionally. The sessions themselves required a different kind of attention than the ones before. The space in the middle, the part that had never been in the reports, did not exist anymore in the same way. What existed instead was something harder to name, a quality of conversation that was entirely documentable and also, if you were paying the right kind of attention, entirely real. She asked better questions in the official sessions than she had in the unofficial ones. He had not expected this. He had expected the supervised versions to be more constrained, more careful. The genuine exchanges replaced by adequate professional substitutes. Instead, the questions were more precise, more direct, structured as if she had thought about them carefully before the session began, rather than finding them as the conversation moved. He realized, in the third week, that she had been preparing, that she had been taking what the unofficial conversations had given her, the things she had learned about how she actually thought and what she actually wanted to understand, and bringing that into the official framework, making it work in the only form available. He started doing the same thing, structuring his preparation around the actual person rather than the official function, finding the genuine substance within the documented form. It was harder. It was also, he thought, more honest. The midnight conversations had had the intimacy of things that existed outside the record. These had the intimacy of things that existed inside it and were still real. He was not sure which was more difficult to maintain. He was fairly sure it did not matter, because both of them were going to maintain it regardless. There was a session in the 5th week where Kareth's oversight appointee left the room briefly to take a communication, and in the 90 seconds she was absent. Nothing happened that would not have happened with her present, but in those 90 seconds both of them noticed the absence, and neither of them changed what they were doing because of it, and somehow that mattered. That what they were when observed was the same as what they were when not observed. Ethan wrote that observation in his own notes after the session, not in the official report, just in his own notes. He wrote, "I think we are all right." He looked at it for a while and then did not cross it out. The protocol violations are real and will not be dismissed. Liaison Vance will undergo full review, and Princess Lyrae will have appropriate additional oversight going forward. However, I will not permit political opportunism to destroy a genuine friendship or my daughter's capacity to lead. The human Vaelorin alliance was built on the premise that our peoples can understand each other across their differences. We have, in this room, evidence that they can. I intend to treat that evidence as the asset it is. Kareth had no mechanism for contesting an imperial ruling directly. The assembly was dismissed. Lyrae crossed the hall to where Ethan stood. She looked tired and resolved, and something else he did not have a word for. "I probably generated an enormous amount of complications for you," she said. "You chose honesty in front of everyone who needed to hear it. That took more than most things I have seen in this profession. We cannot." She stopped, adjusted. "The oversight is real now. The scrutiny is real. There will not be any more unofficial spaces." Her patterns moved through something that held elements of both sadness and acceptance. "I know, but maybe." She met his eyes. "Maybe we do not need unofficial spaces. Maybe we can build something that does not need to be hidden to survive. Monitored, complicated, politically analyzed, but honest. Is that what you want? I want to know you in daylight. Ethan, I want to stop protecting something that is not shameful." Her pattern settled into warm, steady gold. "If you are willing to manage the complications." He thought about the 6 inches of uncrossed space at dawn. He thought about a door opening at 0.43 and the answer he had given without any calculation at all. "I am willing," he said, "whatever comes with it." Ambassador Race appeared beside them with the expression of someone who had already drafted the first 4 contingency reports in her head. "This is going to require protocol development that does not currently exist anywhere." she said. You both understand that. We do, Lyrae said, and we are prepared to help build it. Reyes's expression softened, briefly, for what it is worth. And I say this as someone who is going to spend the next month in procedural meetings. What you two have managed to build under conditions explicitly designed to prevent it is genuinely remarkable. Most diplomatic relationships I have witnessed are strategic constructions. What you have appears to be the opposite. A pause that matters, even when it is complicated. Especially when it is complicated. Ethan said. The months that followed what came next was, by most practical measures, considerably harder than the midnight visits had been. No more unofficial spaces. No more conversations in the gap between the official record and the real one. Every meeting logged. Every session attended or reviewed by designated oversight personnel. Every exchange documented with a thoroughness that made Ethan constantly aware of being on the record. The first 2 weeks were the hardest. Not because what was between them had changed. It had not. But because the conditions under which it had formed had changed completely, and neither of them was certain. At first, how much of it survived the translation? They learned, with the deliberate and sometimes awkward care of two people recalibrating something existing to a different set of constraints. They learned to communicate clearly in supervised conditions, where subtext needed more deliberate handling. They learned which conversations worked within official frameworks and which needed to be held for moments when oversight was present, but not active. They learned, most significantly, that what was real between them did not require secrecy to persist. 6 weeks after the assembly, Kareth tried something different. A formal request, submitted through proper channels, for a joint review of all cultural consultation records between Liaison Vance and Princess Lyrae for the preceding 3 months. Technically within his authority. Transparently aimed at finding something that could be reframed as evidence of ongoing impropriety. Ethan and Lyrae received notification simultaneously. He saw her at the joint session 2 hours later, and her patterns were controlled, but he could read the deep blue underneath the diplomatic silver. After the session, during their official documented consultation, she sat very still. He is going to go through every report you filed, she said. I know. Is there anything in them that can be used? No, he said. The reports are accurate. The work was real. Everything that was not in the reports is not in any log Kareth can access. She was quiet for a moment. He knows that. He is not looking for evidence. He is looking for the appearance of a process. The ability to say concerns were raised. That questions remain. That is enough if he frames it right. What do we do about it? Exactly what we are doing, she said. Continue the documented work. Produce accurate reports. Give the review nothing to work with, except evidence that the official record is complete, and the relationship is functioning exactly as the charter describes. A pause, and wait for him to decide it is not worth the political cost. The review came back 6 weeks later with no findings. Kareth noted his concerns in formal language that would live in the procedural archive indefinitely, and then moved on to other angles. Ethan and Lyrae received notification of the outcome and proceeded with their scheduled session as if nothing had happened. In the session, Lyrae raised an eyebrow at him across the table, barely, the smallest motion, visible only because he had learned to read very small motions. When the oversight officer's attention was briefly elsewhere, he raised one back. Neither of them said a word about it. What Ethan was learning, slowly, was that the translation from private to supervised did not mean losing the essence of what had been there. It meant finding a different grammar for it, the same understanding, the same attentiveness. The same genuine regard that had existed in those midnight conversations was still present. It just expressed itself differently. In the precision of a question asked at exactly the right moment to spare someone a difficult admission. In the way he structured his contributions in joint sessions to create space for her analysis to land. In the specific word choice of a consultation report that documented the facts accurately, and somehow also captured something of the person behind the facts. She did it too. The way she referenced his previous contributions, not performatively, not for the record, but with the specific accuracy of someone who had actually been listening. The occasional margin note in a shared document that was technically a professional annotation and was also, if you knew how to read it, something else entirely. None of it was in any report. None of it needed to be. 3 months after the assembly, Ambassador Reyes requested a private meeting. Both governments have a proposal, she said, when they were alone. A jointly developed one. The proposal was for a newly created position, special cultural liaison to Princess Lyrae's diplomatic office, a full charter, specific responsibilities with clear scope, oversight structures that made the relationship official infrastructure rather than personal arrangement. Both sides reframe the narrative from protocol failure to diplomatic innovation, Reyes said. Karath's faction loses the leverage because the relationship is now official structure rather than a vulnerability. And Lyrae gets, Ethan said, continuity. Reyes paused. And I supported this proposal, not just because it is strategically sensible, because I have watched you both operate for months under conditions designed to make what you were doing impossible. And you kept doing it, and it kept making the work better. That deserves to be official. He accepted. 6 months after the Unity ceremony, the formal position had settled into something that felt, most days, like it had always been there. Ethan worked in Lyrae's official chambers on a structured schedule, cultural analysis and human-side context for her diplomatic initiatives, sessions where that perspective was relevant. The development of exchange programs designed to change how both peoples encountered each other at the level of ordinary life. The documentation was thorough and fully visible. The oversight had become background rather than foreground. It was not the same as those first weeks. He did not want it to be. Those midnight conversations had had a quality specific to their context. The urgency, the vulnerability, the intimacy produced by circumstances that did not allow for pretense. You could not recreate that under official documentation. You did not need to. The loss of it was real, and he had let himself acknowledge that rather than pretending it was not there. What he had not anticipated was how much of the essential things survived. They still talked about real things, not with the same urgency, but in the ordinary margins of the work, in the genuine exchanges between documented sessions, in the moments when oversight was present but not active. Lyrae still had the dry sideways humor that caught him off guard. She was still analytically precise in ways only some people in any given room registered, and he always did. She still asked questions that went to the center of things. He still knew her patterns. Fluent enough now that he could read her emotional state from across a large meeting room, based on variations in her bioluminescence. Automatic, no longer requiring conscious attention. The way reading someone's expression became automatic once you had known them long enough. One afternoon, they were working through documentation for a new educational exchange initiative, one of Lyrae's longer-range programs, designed to change how both species encountered each other at the formative stages of education. Ethan was cross-referencing two sections that used different definitional frameworks for the same core concept. A structural inconsistency that would create implementation problems once the program reached the people responsible for running it. These two sections need to align, he said. If they are operating on different frameworks, the human implementation teams are going to interpret the requirements differently than the Vaelorin teams. And 6 months in, you will have two parallel programs that do not actually connect. I see it. She pulled the sections up on her own display. Which framework do we standardize on? Yours is more technically precise. Mine is more intuitive for the human implementation structure. If we are optimizing for adoption rate, we are optimizing for both adoption and accuracy, she said. Then I will draft a synthesis. I know you will. She looked up from the display and met his eyes across the table. The oversight officer, the reasonable one, had stepped out. Ethan. Thank you. For the synthesis draft. For that first night. She held his gaze. Her patterns were warm gold, steady and clear. For not turning me away. For every night after that. And for all of this after that. For seeing me when I needed to be seen. Thank you, he said, for trusting me enough to come. The door indicated the oversight officer returning. They both turned back to their respective sections of the proposal without anything further needing to be said. The afternoon continued. Proposals, documentation, cross-referencing, the necessary and satisfying work of building something that would matter. Ethan drafted the synthesis framework. Lyrae reviewed it, made 3 precise edits, and approved it. They identified 2 additional structural inconsistencies and worked through both. When the meeting concluded, Lyrae stood and gathered her materials. She paused. Then she crossed back to the table. She placed her hand over his where it rested on the surface beside his notes. Just rested it there for a moment. No pressure. Nothing that required acknowledgement. Her patterns were a full, steady gold that she was not suppressing. He turned his hand over slowly, not gripping, just turning, so that his palm was facing up. For 3 seconds they stayed like that, her hand resting in his upturned palm, both of them looking at the table rather than at each other, both of them very still. Then she lifted her hand and stepped back, and the moment was over. She picked up her materials. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. Her voice was perfectly level, but the gold in her patterns was still there, unhurried, entirely present. "I will be here," he said. She smiled. The real one. The unguarded version that had first appeared in his quarters in the early hours of a morning many weeks ago. It was, he had long since decided, the most remarkable thing he had seen on any world he had visited in 10 years of doing this work. "Good," she said. "I am counting on it." Then she was gone, moving through the door with her habitual grace, back into the hallway and the rest of the world that required her to be all the things it required her to be. Ethan sat in the empty, officially documented, properly supervised chamber for a moment in the full ordinary light of the afternoon. His palm was still turned upward on the table where she had left it. He thought about a question asked in the dark by someone standing at his threshold, like she was prepared to leave the moment he gave her any reason to. "May I stay with you tonight?" Human. He had said yes then, without calculation, without preparation, because someone had come to him needing somewhere safe to be, and he could not look at that need and say no. He would say the same yes again, knowing everything that followed from it, every difficult hour and every careful morning after. The anonymous message, and the conference room, and the assembly hall, and the months of supervised documented work that had done all the same things the secret version had done, but in full view of everyone who had spent considerable effort trying to destroy it. Still yes, in full daylight, under documentation, with the full complicated weight of everything they were, and everything they represented to two peoples trying to figure out what trusting each other actually meant in practice. The answer had not changed. Some things were like that. You built them under the conditions you had, without knowing exactly what you were building. And then the conditions changed, and you found out what had survived. What survived was everything that mattered. Politicians could debate it. Protocols could attempt to contain it. Kareth could continue looking for angles and find only the ordinary ongoing record of two people doing careful, genuine work together. But at the center of it was something simple. A door had opened at 043. A question had been asked at the threshold. Someone had needed somewhere safe to be. And a yes had been given, and had held, and had turned into something neither of them had a name for yet, but that both of them were no longer pretending not to feel. They were building it, day by day, session by session, one carefully documented afternoon at a time. His palm was still turned upward on the table. He left it there for another moment. Then he gathered his notes, filed his documentation, and went to prepare for tomorrow.